Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Is it working? Yeah. Good afternoon. Welcome to Understanding Tomorrow's Nuclear Energy Lecture Series. It is my great pleasure to present to you today the third SMR study lecture. My name is Seung-Jae Kim, Captain James F. McCarthy Jr. and Shore E. McCarthy Head of the School of Nuclear Engineering. As I mentioned earlier, this is our third lecture as part of the joint effort by Purdue University and Duke Energy to explore the feasibility of using advanced nuclear technology to address our Purdue campus's community's long-term energy needs. Before we start, I'd like to ask one of our partners from Duke Energy, Mr. Chris Nolan, to the stage. Mr. Nolan is a vice president of new nuclear generation strategy and planning for Duke Energy. In this role, he is responsible for planning for new nuclear generation to support the company's energy transition to net zero carbon emission. Before joining not Purdue, but Duke in 2006, he also worked for the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission and held many important positions. He's been working very closely with Purdue University as a partner, and for this SMR feasibility study as a member of Principals in Charge. And he will share a few words about this collaboration and share his perspectives. So please join me welcoming Mr. Chris Nolan.
So thank you, Dr. Kim. It's a pleasure for me to be here today. I thought I'd talk a little bit about Duke Energy to put this lecture series in perspective, and then a little bit about the feasibility study. So Duke Energy is the largest utility in the U.S. We operate in 6 states: Florida, South Carolina, North Carolina, Kentucky, Ohio, and Indiana. So Florida is the number 2 solar producing state behind California. North Carolina is the number 4 solar producing state behind Texas. And with all that energy coming onto our system, our nuclear fleet is 83% of the carbon-free energy that we produce. So our nuclear fleet, we have 6 sites in the Carolinas with 11 units. We make 11 gigawatts of energy, more than 50% of what is produced to our ratepayers in the Carolinas. And it's very important to us to go through the energy transformation that we need to achieve climate change. And the feasibility study that we're doing here at Purdue is very important as well. So I give a lot of credit to President Daniels and President-elect Mung Chiang for their vision in creating this public-private partnership in order to us study what the energy transition in the Midwest will look like for our company. We have a lot of things that are going on in the country. The Inflation Reduction Act is certainly important, and it'll create an incentive for utilities to make the transition and also ease the impact on ratepayers. So the feasibility study, the lecture series, I think is very important for engagement and awareness. And then the technical studies on what works in this area will provide leaders and policymakers the information they need to identify the key enablers to make this transition happen. Duke issued its climate change report about 2 weeks ago, and it talks about $145 billion investment over the next 10 years to transition the infrastructure. About half of that is going to be in transmission. And the reason that's important is because we're putting a lot of solar onto the system. But when you look at what provides energy security and what provides 24/7 generation, it's our nuclear fleet. And so we have a climate change goal to get to net zero by 2030, and right now we're at 44%. And we'll get to 50% by 2030, and we'll get to that a little early. Net zero by 2050, and the only way we can get to net zero is adding new nuclear to the system. So the feasibility study is important for us in that context, and I thought that would be valuable to the audience. Right now, I'd like to welcome President-elect Mung Chiang to the stage to introduce our featured speaker. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Chris, for the outstanding partnership between Duke Energy and Purdue University in this joint study of the potential of small modular reactors for Purdue campus. And as President Mitch Daniels has said many times, that one cannot be both sincere and serious about a fully decarbonized future without at least taking a look at nuclear energy's future. And it is in that spirit that we started this past summer an open-ended and open-minded joint exploration in this study of small modular reactors' potential role here. And we couldn't ask for a better partner than Duke Energy. Thank you. And thank you to the whole team here, including Mike Klein and Sungjin Kim and Christina Farmas, many others also in Klein's organization, because are many different tracks going on here in this study. And this is the one that really engages in a dialogue between the experts and all of us, including myself, counting myself as a lay person. I used to be an engineer. I've forgotten pretty much all about it. But to all our neighbors, to the global nuclear energy and renewable energy community, to learn much more about the future evolutions of nuclear energy. And we couldn't ask for a more distinguished international leader in this field than today's distinguished speaker, Bill Magwood. And I'll compress the speaker introduction here so that Bill will have more time with his very important and interesting dialogue here. It is a long and outstanding resume here. Mr. Magwood took up his duties as the Director General of the Nuclear Energy Agency for the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And it represents 38 countries around the world, if I got that number right. So it is truly an international organization. And as the leader of the Nuclear Energy Agency for OECD over the past 8 years, he's been leading many regulatory and developmental aspects of nuclear energy, including these international conversations. From 2010 to 2014, Mr. Magwood served as one of the 5 commissioners appointed by the U.S. President and confirmed by the U.S. Senate to the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, NRC. And as a commissioner, he advocated the importance of nuclear regulatory independence and the necessity of maintaining a strong, credible, technically sound nuclear regulation in the United States and all countries that use nuclear power. Prior to that, from 1998 to 2005, Mr. Magwood was the director of U.S. government's Civilian Nuclear Energy Program at the U.S. Department of Energy. And during his tenure, he established the Idaho National Laboratory, created activities that reversed the decline of U.S. nuclear technical education, and launched the important initiatives such as Generation 4 International Forum and the U.S. Nuclear Power 2010, which helped restart nuclear plant construction in the United States. And we are delighted to be able to welcome Mr. Magwood for the second time over the past 4 years. I remember in my prior job, the College of Engineering, to welcome Bill as a engineering college distinguished speaker to talk about nuclear energy. And now post-COVID, and in light of this brand new joint and serious study, it's a delight to welcome again to our Purdue campus, Bill Magwood. Thank you so much, Bill.
I may roam around a bit. Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Yeah. All right. You're not here to sleep. You're here to listen. Well, first, let me thank the President-elect for coming to launch us off today. I know you have to do some other things this afternoon, but thank you for being here. And my thanks really to all of you for the invitation to come to speak. It is my second lecture here, but not my second visit. I think I've been to the campus about 4 or 5 times over the years in different jobs. Just shows I can't hold a job very long, but this one I've had for a little while. I've actually been here twice with this position. But let me begin by congratulating you on the progress of the program over the years. You know, I visited the campus over the course of probably 20 years, and the program has grown quite substantially over the years. The recognition that it has drawn has been quite remarkable. And really, this new initiative to talk about small modular reactors on campus really lends itself not just simply to the practicalities of decarbonization, but also to something which I think is very, very short in supply around the world, which is the vision to look at the future. So my congratulations to the president of the university, the president-elect, for going down this path, and I'm looking forward to supporting your effort as much as I can. And this issue of vision, I think, is extremely important to think about, because as we look at this new century, this 21st century, which really is only 20 years old, it's not that old. It's older than some people in this room maybe, but it's not been around that long. It's a century that really opens up the door to progress in areas that many of us can barely imagine. The world 20 or 30 years from now will be a very, very different place than it is today. When I look back over the last 20 years, there's been change, there's been evolution. You know, mobile phones have become smaller and easier to use or more powerful, computers are better. But the truth is, life really isn't that different. It's not even that different from even 40 years ago. But when you look into what we're on the threshold of, change is going to be dramatic. And I'm hoping, because I'm an optimist, and I hope you're optimists, I'm hoping that the future will be a brighter place than it is today. And actually, one of the things I think that characterize people in the nuclear sector, I know many of you, maybe not all of you, but many of you are nuclear oriented, that is a character of those of us in this sector. We think the future is a good place. We think the future is a place worth working towards. And we think that the future can be brighter today to tomorrow than it is today. And I am certainly one of those people that believe that. So that's why the vision of what you're looking at is so important, to send a message that we are looking not just at next week or next month or next year, but we're looking 10 years from now and 20 years from now and even 100 years from now. And that's the kind of vision we need these days. So let me talk a little bit about what I do. So I am Director General of the Nuclear Energy Agency, been there for 8 years. And what I do mostly is I bring countries together to do things, to create cooperation, to make nuclear technology more usable, safer, and to push the boundaries of knowledge. And the Nuclear Energy Agency is very active in every realm of civilian nuclear technology and science and policy, law, nuclear waste and regulation. So really all those areas we are involved in. And we bring experts from around the world together to talk about interesting problems. Altogether, there's probably about 3,000 people right now who are involved in NEA activities and working together to advance these subjects. My job as Director General is to set the stage to think about where should we be going in the future. And recently, we've worked very hard on a new strategic plan that looks at where we are today and where we need to be in the future. And our plan, which you can look at online, all of our documents are available online, does something that we haven't been able to do in the past, which is to think very far-sightedly about the role of innovation in our society, and particularly in the context of climate change. Now, climate change is something that in many countries around the world has become kind of the organizing factor in their energy policies. As a matter of fact, I know I've seen, in fact, I'll give you a real live example. I've seen that energy discussions have been completely consumed by the climate challenge. I remember not long ago, a few years ago, we had a ministerial meeting in Paris. And in this meeting, we had ministers from all over the world. There were probably 15 ministers, energy ministers. And each one was asked to give an opening statement of 5 minutes to talk about what they saw as the future of energy in their countries. And so all these countries were represented by the ministers, and they would go around the table, and each one was supposed to talk for 5 minutes. And as I listened to them talking, not one of them mentioned the word nuclear until we got to the U.S. The U.S. Secretary of Energy did mention nuclear. And then there was a French energy minister who talked for 12 minutes instead of 5, and somehow managed never to say the word nuclear. And I was watching this and thinking, how does a French energy minister talk for 12 minutes and not mention nuclear? I mean, how do you do that? That takes a lot of intellectual gymnastics, but somehow she managed to do that. And that really demonstrates what the conversation around the world was like a few years ago. It was dominated by the climate discussion, dominated by the agenda that many countries had to deploy more and more renewables, but it was taken out of the context of what energy conversations had traditionally been about for decades, which was energy security. Well, that has changed dramatically. Clearly, the situation in Ukraine and the ramifications of it have completely changed the energy conversation around the world. It is not the same conversation. The conversation is now solely about energy security with an asterisk about climate change. That's very different from just a short time ago. Now, that's not to say the climate is disappeared from the agenda. It certainly hasn't. It is really very much central to many countries' policies. But now you see this merger of the two coming together. You see the energy security discussion along with the climate change discussion becoming the same discussion. And all of a sudden, in that context, particularly in the aftermath of COP26, where we saw that the world was now on path to converge towards net zero by 2050, we saw that nuclear was coming back into the conversation. So it's obvious that we have to do something, because the current path that you can see in this chart, which was created by Carbon Brief, is a chart that shows us that if we do business as usual, and that's kind of, I think, the red chart at the top, we're really not in a very pretty place. We're going to see very, very high temperatures. We're certainly not going to meet the 1.5 degrees C target, but we're going to essentially be giving up on the global environment. And almost every scenario you see under that has a very similarly dark story. We're not converging. We're not moving towards. We're using up the carbon budget, as a matter of fact. We have, I think, about 8 years left of carbon budget at the current rate. And I don't know anyone that thinks that we can turn the situation around fast enough to deal with this. To some degree, I think this reflects, without saying it out loud, or they don't, but I will, that we actually waited too late to fix this problem in an easy way. We should have been reducing CO2 emissions 20 years ago when the alarms were first being sounded about climate change, and we didn't do it. And the truth is, we're still not doing it. You know, CO2 emissions are still rising around the world. We're still moving away from our goals instead of heading towards them. And how to fix this is something that is going to be a big challenge for policymakers around the world. Now, that's not to say there aren't things we can do. Clearly, there are many different organizations, including mine and the International Energy Agency and others, have done analysis looking at, well, how do we deal with this? So the IPCC, which I think you're all familiar with, issued an analysis a few years ago that looked at 90 different pathways, 90 different studies like these, to look at how do we bring the world to net zero by 2050. And as you can see in this particular chart, this is just a sampling of a few of them. Many of them include a very strong role for nuclear. If you look at these charts, you can see these numbers kind of vary all over the place. But the growth rate of the possible use of nuclear is something, and use this one as well, is something that is part of all these scenarios. Some of them, like this high scenario from IAEA, shows maybe doubling of nuclear capacity by 2050. And then you see the Bloomberg study at the bottom, which is 1,670%. Answer's probably in between somewhere, right? But what these studies are very interesting in that when you look at the 90 pathways that the IPCC found in looking at these different analyses, and you take an average of those 90, you end up with about a tripling of nuclear capacity by 2050. So just in a very rough way, looking at all these different analyses, we'd have to at least triple in order to meet some of these scenarios. And these scenarios don't really look at innovative nuclear technology. They aren't looking at SMRs, they're looking at traditional large light water reactors. So that, you would think, gives us some pause, because we know that traditional light water reactors have proven to be very difficult to build, particularly in Western countries. We haven't been successful in projects in the United States at the Vogtle and Summer plants, in France at Flamanville, Olkiluoto in Finland. We've seen these large cost overruns. We've seen schedules missed by more than a decade. And so many people in the environmental community will come to you and you'll say, well, nuclear obviously can't fill this role. We can't build the plants. We don't know what we're doing. We don't know what to do. We don't know how to build these projects anymore. Now, I think many of you know that there are projects that get built on cost and schedule around the world, and it's done very regularly. In Russia, in China, and even the Koreans were able to do that in UAE. So we know it can be done, and there's lots of studies showing what the problems were with the projects in the US and other countries. It has a lot more to do with a lack of practice, a lack of infrastructure, a lack of supply chain, more than it does the basics of nuclear technology. But at the same time, where's the evidence that we can actually do this? How do we double or triple or even higher the capacity of nuclear's contribution in time to make a difference in terms of climate change? That's a fair question. Now, can we triple the capacity? And we've done analysis on this, and I'll give you our answer. And our answer is yes, but it really requires an all-of-the-above strategy in terms of nuclear. We're going to have to keep both the existing plants on long-term operation as long as we can. We're going to have to build new Gen 3 plants. We're going to need small modular reactors, and we're going to have to look at non-electric applications. I'll very quickly go over some of these because I think they're interesting. The first one is long-term operation. So in many countries around the world, nuclear plants are seen to have almost a definite lifetime. Like it's kind of like they think that once you hit 40 years in one day, it's too dangerous to operate the plant anymore. I don't know what happens that last day where everything falls apart, but that's the philosophy a lot of places have. And of course, you know that's not true. I often use this horrible analogy that a nuclear plant's a lot like a car. If you're willing to change out the brakes or the transmission, put a new windshield in, and you can keep this thing running as long as you really want to keep putting money into it. And that's actually not too far from the reality. As long as the containment building and the pressure vessel in good shape, nuclear plant can operate as long as it's economic, and that's been proven. That's not the view of a lot of countries. And from a policy standpoint, there's a lot of pressure on plants that are older than 40 years. I do expect that's going to change, partially because of economics, but partially because of climate change. There's been a lot of study, including the IEA, which is our sister organization in the OECD, that show that if you lose our existing nuclear power plants, you push the targets so far away in terms of meeting net zero that they become vastly more expensive and may not even really be possible. So this chart shows what's at stake. We could see these plants go offline over the next couple of decades, or we could keep them in operation and avoid 49 gigatons of carbon emissions by 2050. So that's a big component of it. Another part, and this is something that I think is going to become a bigger factor than a lot of people believe. I firmly believe that the answer will ultimately be that we will have to start building large light water reactors again. I'm completely convinced of that because of the numbers, the magnitude shows you that we need to build large light water. Large light water will be built in many countries around the world, and I think it will come back to this country as well at some point because I just don't see another alternative. So large light water, yes, we've had problems. Yes, we've had projects fail. But again, it's more to do with how we were approaching these projects, how the vendors were organized, how the vendors were funded. It has a lot to do with first-of-a-kind risk, with first-of-a-kind technologies and first-of-a-kind regulatory infrastructure. So there's a lot of reasons why we had the problems we had, but the one important factor to keep in mind is if you look at the two AP1000 projects that are moving forward in the U.S. at the Vogtle site, Vogtle Unit 3 is the one that where most of the lessons were learned. Vogtle Unit 4 is moving so fast compared to Unit 3 that they almost have to slow it down to keep it from overtaking Unit 3. But that's because the lessons have been learned and absorbed, and they've found their way into that second unit. And if we were to build another set of AP1000s somewhere else, they would have taken advantage of that learning. That shows these first-of-a-kind lessons have to be absorbed in some way. And I think increasingly that there has to be a government role in providing a safety net for these kinds of costs. So Generation 3 can have a big impact on this, and I think it will. And I've talked to people in other countries, and I believe that they're expecting the same thing to happen. And then there's the SMRs. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that because I know there's a lot of interest in that, and of course you might build one here, so that's pretty exciting. SMRs serve a lot of different roles, and I think it's important to recognize when we use the term SMRs, and I know many of you in the nuclear sector here know this, it's kind of a catch-all for a wide range of technologies. They're both light water-based, Gen 4 technologies. They're mobile reactors that can be on barges or moved around. They can be replacement for coal facilities and therefore mid-size. They can be replacing diesel capacity in remote communities. So there's a wide range of things that they can provide. And very, very importantly, they can provide heat. I'll spend a little bit of time on that. And that industrial heat is a very important aspect of this picture. So SMRs, and I'll just spend a little bit of time on this. They vary in many different ways. I'll just leave this chart for you to look at. When you look at what we say when we mean SMR, you can tell from this chart that we're talking about a vast array of technologies. The IAEA has a report that it puts out, it just put out a recent one, and has identified about 90 different technologies that are under some level of consideration around the world. Now, that's a very dangerous report in a way, because I think it gives the impression there's actually 90 projects that people are investing in to build these systems. And the reality is that the vast majority of these won't get much past the paper stage. So one of the things that we're doing is we're going to put out essentially a dashboard so that people can look at these different technologies and understand how far they're actually along in their development. So it's something we're working on and we'll be releasing soon. But as you can see, there's different applications, there's different configurations. So there's a wide range of things that call themselves SMRs, and they're all over the world. There are places, there's a lot of it going on in North America. Canada has been a real leader in this area, trying to get these things deployed. Big investments in the United States, but the Europeans are also starting to put investments in, and as well, obviously, as the Russians and the Chinese are making big investments, and there's a lot of different configurations, as I mentioned. Some are based on light water technology, some are based on gas-cooled technology, but you see a wide range of different things. And these are all considered to be SMRs. And obviously, not all of them are going to be delivered by the 2030 timeframe. But if you look at where they can serve the role, I think it's very important to recognize that in addition to the long-term operation of existing plants, Gen 3, large light water, they add an important component to the overall picture. They have the potential over a relatively long period of time to displace quite a bit of carbon emissions. In this chart, we estimated about 21 gigatons, I think it was the number. So I think this is something you have to look at. And it isn't just electricity, and becomes a very important factor. It's also which is these non-power applications. So, these non-electric applications. And this is important because there are so many aspects of industry, the chemical industry, the steel industry, where high temperature heat is needed for a variety of purposes. And today, there's no good technology that does not emit carbon to replace the use of coal and other fossil fuels. This is a big challenge. And as we think about the 30% of emissions that come from industrial applications, that come from these types of processes, we have to do something. Nuclear reactors are very, very well suited to this, and this is something that's actually of quite high interest in many places. And if you add hydrogen production on top of that, you get this chart. So if you add it all up, and you ask the question, is it possible to triple nuclear capacity overall by 2050? Again, the answer is yes. But as you can see from this chart, which we put together some time ago, it does require kind of everything. It requires our current fleet staying in operation for the long period. It requires small modular reactors. It requires large light water, and it requires this convergence of electricity and heat. So this is something that is very important to recognize. So it is achievable, but it is not going to be easy. I think that is something that we have to recognize because if you think in terms of where the gap is from current planning, the gap is that big orange thing. And you can see we're very, very far away from where we need to be if we stay business as usual. So what I think the story is from this is that if we're going to be in a position to adjust this future where we miss our targets and we don't have the ability to triple our nuclear capacity and therefore deal with the climate crisis, we need to start today and we need to start immediately. And that obviously is a big challenge because we haven't started today. I mean, there's discussions, there's a lot of things happening. I'm very encouraged by what's happening. I don't want to minimize it. I think it's important. But we're not on track to deal with that gap, and that's something that I think requires a call to action. So there's a lot of enthusiasm about this. As I go to countries around the world and I talk to people about what they're doing and what they think is going to happen, I see an energy and an interest in nuclear technology, the likes of which, quite frankly, I don't think we've seen since maybe the 1960s. It is really dramatically different from anything we've seen before. I know some of you are probably thinking, well, we had the nuclear renaissance back in the early 2000s. This is much, much broader and deeper than that. And it's propelled by this combination of the concerns related to climate change and also the new concerns about energy security. So it creates this nexus of concerns that is driving this along. And more importantly, perhaps, and maybe I'm almost embarrassed to admit this, but one of the reasons I think that this is actually going to work better than previous is because in the past, much of the work was being driven by government. Governments were pushing industry to deploy new technologies and to develop new reactors, using the national laboratories to develop advanced technologies. And when I remember when I was at DOE and we would talk to the industry about advanced technologies, you sort of had this sort of glazed over look and people would think, well, you can almost imagine the wheels in the back of the head saying, why is this person talking to me about something 20 years ago? I'll get fired if I don't fix next week. So thinking about long-term technologies was not where the private sector was. But today, the private sector is driving almost everything in terms of long-term technologies. And so that's a sea change from the past. The private sector is driving small modular reactors. They're driving high temperature gas reactors. They're driving fast reactors. We would never have imagined this even 10 years ago that this was possible, but that's what we've seen today. So very exciting, great promise. So is this a reason to relax at all? No, not quite, because this isn't going to be easy. If we're going to be able to deploy these new technologies, quite frankly, a lot of things have to go right. And I'm going to talk with you sort of at the end here about a few things that a few observations I would make. First thing is that we have an industry infrastructure that has not built nuclear plants really, except for these 2 projects down in Georgia, for 2 generations. So the lesson of Vogel and Summer is that if you don't build nuclear plants for 25 or 30 years, don't expect to be able to turn it all on overnight and have great projects. It just doesn't work that way. And we're not much stronger than we were before. There might be a little bit more infrastructure to support AP1000s, but for all these other technologies, it's all brand new. It's all unproven. So industry really has to prove it can execute. Can they build projects? Can they build plants on cost and schedule? Can they achieve what they say that they want to do? They have to prove it. There's no shortcut to that. So that's a big challenge, to prove to all of us that they can actually execute these projects. They also have to have an idea of how all this is going to work. So many of these technologies rely on the use of remote operated equipment, innovative reactors that can basically be operated autonomously in remote locations. How is this going to work? There's a lot of talk about it, but no one has really shown me how this will actually work as a practical matter. Biggest concern that I have, if I had to pick one major concern, it's the supply chain. The supply chain is thousands of small contractors, small and large, around the country and around the world, that build the parts that go into a nuclear plant, whether it's a big plant or a little plant. And they have to be built to a certain quality, and they have to have a certain pedigree. And what we found, again, looking at the AP1000 projects, is the supply chain we thought we had wasn't as good as we had hoped. In fact, it was far, far less good than we had hoped, and we found lots of holes and lots of problems. And so why do we think that's different today? I'm not sure that it is. So this is a major concern. So finding a way to make sure that the supply chain lives up to expectations will be a major challenge in the future. And it's something I know that many people in the industry are worried about, but they also don't know exactly what to do about it. So this is something we're watching very closely. And it's also something governments are thinking about, which is very positive. Then there's the regulators. Yeah, as you heard, so I was the NRC commissioner, so I have a pretty good sense of what happens in regulatory organizations. I work with regulators around the world. I talk with them all the time. And regulators are determined, they say, not to be the reason that all this fails. They do not want to be the wall that prevents these SMRs and other technologies from being successfully deployed. But the reality is that regulators do have lots of challenges. New technologies, they worry regulators a little bit. There's a lot of work that goes into approving new technologies. Think about NuScale. I think all you're familiar with NuScale. NuScale is a light water-based technology. There's nothing in the terms of physics, nothing really that new. It just does things that light water reactors have always done, just does a little bit differently, a little bit different engineering. NuScale spent over $1 billion, it hasn't built anything yet to get regulatory approval. That's a light water reactor. What's it going to be like when we have a molten salt reactor or some other exotic technology? That's something you have to think about. And then that's in the U.S. And it's really funny because I come to the U.S. and people say, boy, U.S. are really tough. The U.S. regulators are really tough. No one wants to do anything here. Oh my God, you have no idea what's overseas. It is so much tougher to get new things, to have flexibility, to risk-informed processes in many overseas countries compared to the U.S. It's a whole different world, and regulators in many other countries are vastly more conservative than what you see in the U.S. Or Canada. So how to have these new technologies be successful in a global market when you have this varied regulatory approach in many different countries? It's not easy. But that's one of the things they have to do, the second tick there. They have to have global thinking. They have to think globally. Now, regulators are responsible for their national situations. They're responsible for, NRC is responsible for what happens in the U.S. They're not responsible for what happens in France. But if we're going to deploy these technologies and have hundreds of reactors possibly built of one type, Doesn't it make sense that the regulators will coordinate their activities on some level to avoid having different conclusions drawn on the same technology in different countries? Because if that's the case, how do you even produce these reactors? How do you build them? What do they look like? Do you have to change them for every market? And if you do that, don't you lose all the advantages of having small modular reactors in the first place? So this is a big issue for us. And I can tell you, this is going to be hard because regulators, it's really hard to bring them together to work. I spent a lot of time trying to get them to work together. Sometimes you think it's impossible. I don't want to give up on them because we need them to do this, but it's hard. And they also generally don't like new paradigms. It is possible. I mean, look at, for example, the NRC last week announced for NuScale, and I bring up NuScale only because it's the most advanced in the regulatory process, but NuScale is going to have a risk-informed emergency preparedness zone. That's a big deal. Now I'm waiting to see exactly what the details of that is, but having the regulators say that perhaps the EPZ of a nuclear facility could be compressed to something like close to site boundary, that's a game changer. That's a big deal. But I can tell you, you're not going to get that in a lot of other countries. And that's a problem, because if NuScale wants to sell a reactor in, say, a European country, and the regulator says, well, I saw rid of all this risk-informed thing, but I need to have an EPZ, whether you risk-inform or not, and I need it to be 10 kilometers. Then what have you gained by having this new technology? It's a real challenge, and I think it's one that's going to be persistent for quite some time. There's other issues as well. Somebody has to pay for all this, and a lot of the attributes of nuclear technologies are not really reflected in electricity markets. To some degree, I consider electricity markets in a lot of places to be completely broken. The fact that you can have electricity priced at negative on a regular basis in some parts of the United States and some parts of Europe, to me, is evidence that the market doesn't work already. I don't know why people think negative pricing makes sense, but to me it doesn't, and I don't think it's sustainable. But it shows you the markets are not configured to move us in a direction we need to go. And I will admit, I am a latecomer to this. I do learn. I make up my mind on things, but I do learn. I was resistant to the idea for a long time, but I have finally accepted that the only way that we're ever going to get our arms around reducing CO2 emissions is to price carbon. It's that simple. There's just no other way that works except for to put a price on carbon and slowly escalate over time. And that's something that is complex societies like ours should be able to do. The fact that it says that we use the word tax associated with that takes it completely off the table is very, very unfortunate, even though I am someone that would have resisted this probably 10 years ago. But after looking at everything else has not succeeded. So we have to adjust the markets to recognize the value of carbon-free electricity, the value of dispatchable assets, the value of reliability. And I talk to economists, and I know economists that tell you there's no value to reliability at all. I say, how is that possible? I have utility, where's Duke's here, right? Utility CEOs stay up at night worrying about reliability. How is there no value to that? There has to be. We have to figure this out. So it's very frustrating. We've already talked about first of a kind. I think this is a structural issue. I think this is something where governments have to play a role to create a safety net for first of a kind projects. And I also think we have to do something with financing, because if you're going to reach net zero, it's not going to happen by itself. You're going to have some way to finance these projects, particularly first of a kind projects, and not just in the US, but really around the world. Because if you want to see countries like Romania, for example, reduce their reliance on coal and natural gas, you want to help them build nuclear facilities, they can't afford it today. So you have to find a way to finance these projects. Final area that I'll mention is what I consider to be infrastructure challenges. And this is something that I think there's some work on all these areas, but probably not enough. I think many of you are probably familiar with the HALEU problem. Most of these advanced reactor designs rely on high assay, low enriched uranium, sometimes up about 19% or higher. We don't have any. It's that simple. There just isn't enough out there to supply to all these different projects. And I don't really see a good plan on the table to get us there. The IRA, as you heard mentioned earlier, could create a path for this, but it's not happening quickly enough. And I already know for an absolute fact, I discussed this with an industry group, there's already an advanced technology that was bypassed by a potential customer because of this issue, because there wasn't a secure way of getting the high assay low enriched uranium. It's a big problem. Codes and standards. This is a boring issue on one level, but also one of the most important issues on another. We had a workshop at the NEA a couple of years ago, right before the pandemic, actually. And one of the questions that I was trying to get out of this workshop, which was about how other industries harmonize their activities. And I always wondered, what is it about nuclear that's so different from, say, the aerospace industry, that you can sell a 787 all over the world and you don't have to change it? But a nuclear facility, you have to go through 5 to 10 years of licensing before you can do anything. Why is that? And there's no simple answer to that question, but a core answer is codes and standards. Codes and standards in other industries that do harmonize are internationalized, they are agreed by the whole community, including governments and regulators, and they cover a lot of ground, much more than they do in the nuclear sector. And I think this is something where we could make some progress by harmonizing codes and standards. We have too many different codes and standards that do the same thing in different ways. It's not necessary, it's expensive, and it's a barrier to being able to really have a harmonized approach. And finally, human resources. This is a big issue for many countries. They don't have enough people going into the nuclear sector. It's a barrier to progress for regulators who can't hire enough people to regulate what they like to do. So this is something we all will have to give some thought to. So we recently unveiled with our membership something called our SMR strategy. And we're going to look at all these pieces and try to have an integrated approach to address them. So all these questions that come up on both the technologies and what we need to make them successful and understanding the markets, we're going to have an integrated strategy that will cross-cut the whole agency, looking at not just technology, but also waste and safety and radiation protection and all these other areas and markets, and try to have an integrated approach to looking at how we approach this. It doesn't mean that we at the NEA will do fill all these gaps, but we'll be able to identify the gaps so that at least our member countries will understand where we have the knowledge and where we don't have the knowledge. And in cases where we can help fill that gap. But maybe others, IAEA or others, have to fill other gaps. But this is a way of trying to get a handle on the whole picture. So I think I'll just close with that and just note that I think it's extraordinarily important that we do get our arms around this, because failure isn't the failure of the nuclear sector. It could well be the failure of our societies to rise to the climate challenge. And I think this is a challenge that many people see as our generation's greatest test. And right now, the test scores are coming back and they don't look good so far, I'll say that. But I think there's a reason for that. I think part of the reason is the way we've presented this to the public has been problematic. On one hand, you have people, and largely I would say this happens in the US, they say that we can fix the climate crisis and it really won't cost you anything. It won't cost you more to drive your car, it won't cost you more to heat your house, it won't cost you more to buy clothes. You can kind of live your life and don't worry, we'll save the environment, which is a lie. When you hear people say, when you ever hear people say that, it's just not true. The magnitude of the problem means that things have to change. And then in Europe, usually in the Scandinavian countries, you see this philosophy more, where the belief is that the problem is that we are wasteful, that we use too much of everything. And their recommendation is that, well, maybe everyone should just start riding bikes more often. And they ride lots of bikes over there, I can tell you. So everyone, stop driving, ride a bike. And of course, I'm just making it fun here, but of course, a young lady that took the sailboat across the ocean because she didn't want to pollute the environment with an airplane ticket. Okay, this is a long way back. And then the worst part, perhaps, is the suggestion that perhaps people in developing countries just have to satisfy themselves with just minimal amounts of energy they can get from solar panels and a few wind turbines. And that if they want to have a more developed society to reach our quality of life, well, maybe at some point in the future, but not right now. It'll hurt the environment. This is a loser. This is an absolute loser. Again, getting back to sort of who we are as a sector, I think that we are people that believe that you can eat your cake and have it too, that you can save the environment, you can provide for prosperity, you can provide energy for people around the world in both developed and developing countries, and do it in a way that saves the environment. And I think that is, in my view, the most important message we can take to the public, that we can do this, and we can do this without giving up our society's benefits. So this is something that will require not just innovative technologies, but it really require us as a sector, vendors, regulators, utilities, everyone, to really be working in partnership to make these technologies successful. Because if we look at this as adversaries and just vendors who are just looking for a buck, we're going to fail. And that would be unfortunate, because if our failure, again, is the failure of meeting our climate objectives. So with that, I thank you for your attention.
Oh, no, I have it. Oh, okay.
Oh, you have two.
All right, thank you so much. What a great lecture. I really enjoyed. One of the reasons why I enjoy your lecture is always you present this practical issues that we need to address, and I really appreciated that you did that today. Since we are running out of time, we are scheduled to have this lecture until 4, so we have literally about 5 minutes left. I was actually, we collect these, questions when we ask, when people register to this lecture series, we ask them to, list these questions. And I was looking at the list of questions, and I was checking, and I think you already addressed most of the questions. That's the good part. There is one thing that I'd like to ask. Maybe we can close today's lecture by addressing this. You presented us this, very important practical issues: infrastructure, supply chain, regulatory issues, and the policy. Do you have any recommendations how we can resolve this? These are the challenges or obstacles that we have to go through and resolve in order for us to really implement nuclear plants. And if you can share with your perspective as to what could be NEA's role in this, in the global nuclear community, as well as what we can do as a local community to help this achieve. We'd appreciate your perspectives on that.
Right. You see, I have 5 minutes to answer that question. Well, I think to some degree it's actually not complicated on a conceptual basis. We basically have to take the challenge seriously. While we have the President of the United States and many other world leaders that talk about climate with a great deal of passion, that we have to solve this, we have to reduce CO2 emissions. The reality is that most governments, while they talk this talk, they're not really walking that walk. They're really not. They're not taking the actions that would be necessary to deal with what they say is an existential threat. Now, so look, this is the analogy I use. So when was the last time you saw governments deal with something they saw as an existential threat? And I point to two things in recent history. I point to World War II, and I point to the Cold War. In World War II, the United States completely converted this whole economy to fight the war. You couldn't buy stockings because they were making parachutes. Cars were harder to get because they were building tanks and airplanes. They just changed it. They changed the economy because they said, this is important, and everyone believed it was important, so they made the change. And the Cold War is also an interesting example. In the Cold War, the United States built the entire national laboratory system. Spent trillions, literally trillions of dollars on infrastructure to fight the Cold War. Compare that to what we've done so far in the climate challenge, and it's not even funny. It shows a lack of seriousness of this issue. So I'm not saying we should spend the trillions of dollars. I'm not going to say that. That's not my point. My point is to simply say that when you compare the urgency of what we saw during the Cold War to what we see today, it's hard to see where the urgency is. So if we're really serious about this, you have to make changes. You have to price carbon. You have to change the way we do business, and you have to also, as I mentioned earlier, you have to think globally. We have to work together to make this work, and if we're not working across borders, and where everyone's got their own favorite design that they're going to promote, which is what's happening right now, it's never going to converge. We're never going to get there. So that to me, that's the most important thing. And what the NEA can do is we can communicate that. And we can provide a platform for them to work together, but you can't drag them to the table every time. If they have to want to work together, and right now I'm not seeing that.
Yeah, thank you very much. I hope NEA, as a global institution, I hope that you can, provide us with a platform to work together so that the global community can reach to the point where we can work together on the nuclear power. I think we ran out of time, so I'll have to stop here. But before we close, I'd like to use this opportunity to talk about the next lecture, which I think will work out very nicely after years. So next lecture will be on November 30th, and we'll be meeting at Fowler Hall for that lecture. It'll be given by Dr. Richard Lester. Dr. Lester is a Japan Steel Industry professor and associate provost at MIT. He is a well-renowned scholar for his research on nuclear technology, innovation, management, and control. And he will give us a lecture on the topic of so-called tough tech for climate, innovation challenges, university responsibilities, and some comments on nuclear role. So this will be a nice follow-up lecture after years. And with that, on behalf of...
I'm going to jump in because I want to say something about Richard. As you know, right, we've recently, with the NEA, because of the interest in building human capacity, we formed a collaborative called the Global Forum on Nuclear Education. And this is bringing together universities around the world, nuclear universities around the world, to work on issues like improving the gender balance, improving innovation in the nuclear sector, improving the future of nuclear education itself. And universities around the world are today working on this, including Purdue is part of this. And Dr. Lester is chair of the council that oversees this activity. So when he's here, ask him lots of questions about the Global Forum. Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And with that, on behalf of Purdue, Duke Energy, SMR Feasibility Study Team, I'd like to thank you again for this great lecture. I'd love to talk with you overnight, but I know that you have to go. So please give another round of applause for today's lecture.